Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line in favor of the Russians in the northern and southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, within and outside the borders. The Russians have managed to advance in the vicinity of Liman in the eastern flank, as well as to the south of Siversk, where we really can at this point conclude that we are at the end game of the Siversk battle, which has waged for 3 years. The Russians continued offensive operations along the second line of defense in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region in the southern section of the front line, where they continued their offensive operations through the rear of the fortifications and the supply lines the Ukrainians have available for their frontline positions in the area. Starting out along the second line of defense within the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians have managed to secure their positions here in the northeastern parts of the recent advances near Beresova and Kalinivske, where they've managed to secure the forest lines to the west of the road connecting Sosnivka in the north with Beresova in the south, where the Russians are strengthening the logistics of the forces in this area. As they continue offensive operations along the fortified positions and trenches in the north, the Russians have passed through Kalinivske following the capture of the settlement and are now fighting within Verbove, where we see with this geolocated footage the Russians have reached the central parts of the town and are fighting over it. The Russians have secured the forest lines on the vicinity on the southern flank of the river line, while fighting continues over the fortified positions on the northern flank. From this we can see that the Russians are on the final fortifications along the river line to the north, from where we see an additional dip in the fortifications, where there are fewer fortifications centered around the southern flank of Vishneve and further up north in the vicinity of Novoalexandrivka. Both of these are facing mostly the southern direction, centered around a defense to the south, with the Russian forces gaining control over the remaining fortified positions in the east. They can push in the direction of Oleksivka and then through the rear of these fortifications towards Novoalexandrivka. Where if we take a closer look at the area between the river line to the south and Vovcha River to the north, there is the settlement of Orestopil, Tighe, and Dobrasove and Oleksandrivka further west. These are the settlements to the south of the river line. Then there are the three settlements of Oleksivka, Novoalexandrivka, and Hai along the central parts, and then along the southern river line, the defensive lines and the positions along the highway. There are an additional 5 settlements all the way to the river line in the western direction, where there is Andrivka and Novosklyovovace, as well as Pisensi. These are all of the settlements in the area which can be closed off as an additional section. Take a look at the section of the front line. There are 2 sections. There's the river line here in the western direction that connects up to Danilivka. Then there's the western river line, and then there's the northern river line. This means this entire area that I am painting in red is an area where the Russians can concentrate their forces to gain control of, with a river line to every single side. This will mean that the Russians can capture these areas and have the geographical natural barriers to defend their flanks along the highway to the north, which will allow them to reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk as a logistical hub in the north and isolate the northern highway from Huliaipole. While if we take a look at the southern flank, we can see that there are several fortifications and defensive positions of the Ukrainians, but there are no significant river lines in the area, unlike the northern direction where there are a lot of river lines. Instead, there is the final river line here in the northeastern flank. Beyond that, there are some smaller ones, but no significant ones all the way to Huliaipole. This means the Russians will look to gain control over the southern, eastern, and northern banks of these river lines before passing through the river line in the southern direction and developing defensive operations along the first line and second lines of defense of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region to gain control over Huliaipole as the main logistical hub in the section of the front line, connecting the Russian forces and supplies in the southern supply lines along Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Rostov, with the newly built rail connection between Rostov and Melitopol, as well as the naval connection with the ports. The Russians would be able to connect their forces from Berdyansk to Huliepole through the highways to supply their forces in this section of the front line, significantly improving the logistics of the Russian forces in the Zaporizhia region and gaining control over the defensive lines on the eastern flank of the Zaporizhia region, which significantly improves the offensive capabilities of the Russian forces, not just in the Zaporizhia region, but also into the Dnipropetrovsk region and the following regions along the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Taking a look at the Siversk section of the front line, the Russians made a significant advance along the southern flank in the vicinity of Vemka, gaining control over Vemka and the railway area all the way up to the southern flank of the next defensive position of the Ukrainians. They also connected with the forces along the fortifications northeast of Vemka, completely solidifying their control over the Venodarivka fortification and Vemka area, as the Russians are now fighting over the outskirts of Siversk, which points to the endgame of the Battle of Siversk. The Russians are now going to be working on advancing along the railway area to the southern flank of Siversk, getting control over the fortifications on the southern flank, the eastern flank, while they are sieging the current positions in the northern flank, operationally encircling the Ukrainian forces remaining in the area to gain full control of it, and having the road going through Serebryanka to the northern flank of Siversk. The Russians are now one assault with no Ukrainian fortifications away from entering Siversk and gaining a foothold within the town. At the same time, the northern flank is completely open following the Russian counterattack near the Serebryanki direction, pushing through from the Serebryanski forest area across the river line to the northern flank, through the fortifications from the southern flank, and pushing directly from the eastern flank. The Russian forces from the Serebryanski forest area has connected with the forces in the Siversk section of the front line, strengthening the offensive capabilities of the Russian forces in the area, and now threatening the supply lines to Siversk from the northern flank. With the recent advances to the southern flank of Siversk, both along the southwestern railway and now also the southeastern railway, and gaining control over some of these fortifications and defensive positions, significantly bolsters the Russian offensive capabilities in the area and develop the offensive operations in the northern direction to the southern flank of Siversk, and from the northern flank in the southern direction towards Siversk, gain full control over the settlement and the surrounding positions. At the same time, the Russians are developing the offensive operations on the eastern flank of Liman, where we aren't really at the endgame of the Liman siege yet, as the Russians still need to gain control over the remaining supply lines to the northwest of Liman and to solidify their control on the eastern direction and the western bank of the Sherebets river line to gain full control over Mirne, Starishne, the fortified positions on the outskirts, and the positions near Yampil and the fortifications in the area. Once they've gained control over those and the supply lines, the siege of Liman itself can begin. Until then, the Russians are still working on the flanks of Liman. The Russians have managed to gain control over the northern parts of Yampil, or about 40% of the settlement, where they are slowly pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications to gain full control over the settlement, with control over the northern flank and the first houses in the direction. The Russians have significantly improved their positions in the area and solidified their foothold, which will allow them to push through the settlement itself and to start threatening the fortifications of the Ukrainians on the northern flank of the settlement, as the Russians are developing their offensive operations to gain full control over Yampil. At the same time, the Russians gaining control over the fortifications north of Yampil and the railway connection towards it will improve the logistic lines for the Russian forces operating in the area and connect with the forces in the Zareshny direction. Gaining control over the southern parts of Zareshny as well as the fortifications on the outskirts of the settlement and connecting with the forces in the Yampil direction to the south will enable the Russians to have a steady supply line towards Liman on the eastern flank. Gaining control over Yampil in its entirety and pushing down in the southern direction as well will allow the Russians to cut off the highway connection between the Ukrainian positions within Liman and the surrounding areas and the positions within Siversk and the surrounding areas, the main highway here in the vicinity of Ozerne, Dibrova, and Yampil. This will allow the Russians to have a road connecting Zareshny to Ozerne in the south, along the roads here along the Serebryansky forest area, and the final ports of the Serebryansky forest area on the northern bank of the Siversky Donetsk River. The Russians will be working on gaining control over the settlements here within the forested areas before they start storming the city itself. The Russian offensive operations taking place within the vicinity of Liman, Siversk, its first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region, as well as the recent reversal of the situation on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the developments within the city itself, and the developments on the flanks of Kościantynivka, the Russians are continuing the developments of the offensive operations on a very wide section of the front line, both in the vicinity of Kościantynivka, the Siversk and Liman almost being one front line combined, the northern and eastern flank of Pokrovsk, as well as the developments in the south, and then finally the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and the entry into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. We're seeing that all of these developments are centered around the Donetsk region, but are also developing on the flanks of the region. Once the Russians bypass the Donetsk region, we're seeing a significant increase in the rate of advancements, despite the fact that the areas are much wider and they have well-prepared defensive fortifications. The central parts and everything surrounding the defense of the Ukrainians in the southern and eastern section of the front line are centered around the Donetsk region. If the Ukrainians lose control over the Donetsk region, then the system of the defensive lines and positions and logistics of the Ukrainians that is all centered around the Donetsk region will be splitting into different parts rather than one well-connected defensive system. We can see the Russians would be able to push into the rear of the Donetsk region, into the Kharkiv region, the Poltava and Dnipropetrovsk regions, as well as the south in the direction of the rear of Zaporizhia. The Russians will be able to start developing offensive operations in less defended areas with no geographical barriers, and the Russian offensive capabilities will significantly increase beyond that of the Donetsk region. Therefore, if no negotiation takes place and the Russians end up taking military control over the Donetsk region, it is likely that the Russians will be increasing their demands in case of a negotiation, because they will simply have the opportunity and the ability to take much more control over Ukrainian lands compared to what they are currently requesting. The main defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians are centered around the Donetsk region and the Dnieper River. Beyond those two positions, the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians are significantly weakened and inferior to the current positions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.